guys, it's me Crystal and welcome to our 4th Top 5 Wednesday video. So the prompt for this week, March 24th is, well, that dragged, or maybe it didn't. A year ago, Melbourne went into lockdown like most of the world. So in unfond memory, this week the topic is to discuss books that had strange pacing, whether it was the book itself or a result of the way you read it. Alternatively, you could also talk about books that went on longer than necessary. So, per usual, I will put a link to the Goodreads group in the description box, and let's just get started talking about the books. And the first two books I'm going to talk about are ebooks, so I'm going to throw a picture of them up here, and they're both by Joe Hill. And the first one is Nosferatu, and Nosferatu is kind of like a supernatural suspense. So it's basically about this guy who abducts children, and he drives around in this old car, and the car helps him not only like slip in and out of like this pocket world that he created, but it also allows him to drain the lives from these children. And so he like stays young and like keeps living, and these children turn into creepy little monsters. And there's multiple point of views, and one of the main point of views, I can't remember her name right now, but she can also like slip in and out of a pocket world, and she does this by the use of her bike, which works kind of like this creepy old guy's car. And so we first meet her when she's younger, and then we go all the way through adulthood. And this book is really, really long. So it's long because we're spanning quite a few years, but it's also long because in between like these really tense scenes, which were like really tense, and it was actually too tense for me and let me feel like kind of exhausted. But in between this, we had like what felt like super long scenes where actually the story was getting kind of boring. So I wouldn't say the pacing was strange. I would just say that the book was really, really long, and I felt like it was probably longer than it absolutely needed to be. I did think it was a really good book, and I did really like it, but because it was so long and it felt so long and it was so exhausting, I didn't love it as much as like I could have loved it, you know? And speaking of Joe Hill books that I felt like were longer than necessary, the next book I'm going to talk about is The Fireman, also by Joe Hill. And unfortunately, I kind of read these books back to back, so I was probably also still a little bit tired of Nosferatu. And then I read The Fireman, and again, while I thought this was really good, it was also like really, really long, and way longer than I think it needed to be. And it didn't even really span that much time. I think maybe it spans probably maybe about a year, and we also skipped some time here and there, you know. So I found the pacing in this to be very similar to the pacing in Nosferatu, where we have these like really tense, exciting scenes like interspersed with like these really kind of long, boring scenes. And so I go back and forth between being exhausted from all the tension and excitement to being exhausted because like I'm dying of boredom. But like I said, I did really like both of these books, but I do feel like they were both longer than they absolutely needed to be. So the next book I want to talk about is The Poison Diaries Nightshade by Mary Rose Wood, and this is in partnership with the Duchess of Northumberland. And this story was paced super weird. So this is book 2, and it was book 2 of what was supposed to be a trilogy, but then the trilogy didn't happen. I think I talked about this in a tag or something earlier this year or late last year, but I liked this book, but the pacing was super, super weird. It's really hard to give a summary of this book since it's a book 2, but basically in book 1, you have this girl, her dad is like a healer, he's like a doctor or something, and so he uses these herbs and plants and poisons, and he goes around using these plans to like help people and like help them with their ailments and whatnot and whatever. And so eventually he picks up this stray named Weed, and Weed has like this really intuitive knowledge about plants, and so the girl's dad like really wants this knowledge from this boy. So anyway, in book 2, the boy has a runoff and then the girl is looking for this boy, and it gets really, really weird. And it was weird in a way that I thought was interesting, but I can also see like you know, why the series got canceled at the same time. But yeah, the pacing for this was really strange. And so, like, we alternate between Weed's point of view and the main character's point of view, whose name I forget. Weed's point of view is pretty straightforward, like, it's pretty evenly paced. But her point of view, she, like, gets into, like, a couple of different, like, sticky situations. And the first one, we get to see most of it, but it gets, like, really weird, though, to the point where it didn't really make any sense. And then, like, the second kind of thing she falls into, like, that whole thing is just glossed over. And so we go to Weed's point of view, and then we go back to her point of view, and like several months have passed by, and she's like a completely different person. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, what happened? But we don't know, and we don't get to know because the author like completely glosses over, probably because it was pretty dark and this is a YA book, and she just didn't want to go there, even though I'm like, it would have been better if you had. And so yeah, so then the girl and Weed are in the same place, and it's just really, really strange, and it makes less sense. Every single page makes less sense than the page before it. I still kind of liked it though, but it was just like, the pacing was like really, really weird in this book. And speaking of book one, the pacing in book one is also like really, really slow. Now, again, I like that book and I don't mind slow pacing because I thought the story was interesting and the characters were interesting, but it was really slow. And this, while it wasn't slow paced, it was very strangely paced. So next I want to talk about Stepsister by Jennifer Donnelly. This isn't a case of the pacing being slow or strange or even the book being longer than necessary. I mean, technically this book was longer than necessary because there were several point of views and they were not all necessary. You know, like, I would actually argue that none of the other points of view were necessary. To me personally, all they were doing, besides making the book longer, and this is already a pretty short book to begin with, so not only was it making the book like longer than I think it would be naturally, it was also like ruining the plot for me. And so all these other points of view were doing was just telling me like what was about to happen, like in the main point of view. And I'm like, okay, well, could you let me be surprised? No, you have to ruin everything for me. And then there were like weird points of view where there was like a mouse point of view and there was like a horse point of view. And I really don't like animal points of view, and not for the reason you think. It's just like I have a weird thing about like skeletons and robots. I have like a weird thing about animals talking. I really don't like it. And even though these animals weren't talking, it was like you were getting their thoughts, and that's pretty much the same thing as them talking, and I don't like that. And it was also incredibly unnecessary. And so, yeah, it's not like it felt long, you know, like, you know, the Joe Hill books I was talking about, but it was just like, it was obviously, all those other point of views were obviously there to make this book longer. They just weren't necessary. And it really kind of ruined the story for me. Okay, so this is a Cinderella retelling, but it's from one of the stepsisters' point of view. And so if you read like the original fairy tale, in order to fit their foot in the shoe, one of the sisters cuts off her heel and the other one cuts off her toe. And so I think this is the one where this is from the point of view of the stepsister who cuts her heel off. And then the shoe fills up with blood and it's super gross, but like in a fun way. So I feel like if the only point of view in this book was like the stepsister's point of view, I would have really liked this book. Like, it maybe would have been at least a 4-star read, if not a 5-star read, but it ended up being a 3-star read. And like the kind of 3-star read where I was like, no, I did not like this, but I really liked like the stepsister's point of view and like her character arc and everything. But it would have been better if the other points of view were not always constantly like telling me what was about to happen to her and what was going on, and just basically ruining the entire plot for me like 10 pages into the book or something. So I did not appreciate that. But basically, the only reason why I'm keeping this book is because the cover is so pretty. And yeah. So the last book I want to talk about is Sleep in the Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. So this is another case of me giving the book 3 stars, but I actually thought this was a really good book. I just didn't like it. And one of the reasons I didn't like it was because this book just kind of wore me out. Now, the pacing in this book is actually pretty fast, and this is a lot longer than it looks because the paper is really thin. And you know, there are like a lot of words on the page and everything. So this is an 800 something page book, but it was actually paced really quickly. But it still felt long, if that makes sense. You know, so even though it didn't take me that long to read it, it took me a surprisingly short amount of time to read this book because the pacing is so quick. But there was just like a lot of details in this book, and I don't read a lot of books like this, and I don't normally like books that take place in space. So I'm actually really surprised that I was able to continue reading this book. And when I talked about this in the reading wrap up, I think at the very end of last year, you know, I was talking about how like I'm just not the kind of reader who likes, you know, like long action scenes in books. And this had like a lot of long action scenes. And then of course, like Joe Hill's books, in between these long, exciting action scenes were these just like long dead spaces of people just traveling through space and her just wandering through this spaceship or whatever. And it was a little not interesting. It was also like a little repetitive. And so after a while, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I get it. Like, space is huge. And, you know, even though they're going faster than light, you know, it takes several months to go from this, you know, one end of space to another end of space. But I just felt like they were just constantly, you know, going into cryo. And even though it skips a lot of that because it kept happening, it's like, yes, you're skipping, you know, this because everybody is going into a state of hibernation, you know, but you're still mentioning it and it still like keeps happening. And it was just a little boring. And yes, even though I read this book fairly quickly, it did feel like it was really long and it felt like it was never going to end. Like, okay, so I think the total page count for this book is like 860 something or 870 something, but the book actually ends, I want to say on page like 830. Let me check. So if you count the appendix, this book is 872 pages long. But you actually get to the end of this story on page 825. And so when I got to the last chapter and I realized I only had like 5 pages left to read instead of like 55 pages, I literally almost cried tears of relief because I was so tired. I was so tired of reading this book. And like I said, I think this is a really good book, especially if you like sci-fi and you like long books and like thick books and books that are like super detailed and there's like a lot of world building. The world building is really good, but you know, it's not my favorite thing. So yeah, I read this book for this prompt because I just felt like it was just like super long and it didn't need to be that long. And it also felt like all those action scenes did not need to be that long. So anyway. Okay, so that is all for this video. Let me know if you've read any of these books. I'm actually really interested to know if anybody else has read The Poison Diaries or The Poison Diaries and Nightshade, and if they felt like the story needed a third book, because I already mentioned this in whatever tag I talked about this in, but I don't feel like it needed a book 3. I actually feel like the story could have wrapped up in like one more chapter. I actually wrote in this book. I don't write in my books very often, but I actually made myself a note that says my thoughts on how everything ends. And I wrote a paragraph on the last page of the book, just wrapping it up because like I said, I really feel like it could have wrapped up. But I would be really interested if anybody has read this book and then what you think about it. But that is all for this video, and I will see you guys on Monday, and happy spring. And I hope your allergies aren't flared up. My allergies are kind of flared up right now, which is just so not the best thing. So I will see you guys next time. Bye.